If you have studied Wallace Wattles seriously, if you have read The Science of Getting Rich more than once, if you have worked with the formless substance, if you have wrestled with the distinction between the competitive and the creative plane, then you have been standing in a building without ever seeing the foundation. Wattles did not invent the law he taught. He applied it. He made it accessible, practical, and focused on wealth. But the theoretical architecture, the precise description of why thought impresses upon universal substance and produces material results, that architecture came from one place, a series of lectures delivered in Edinburgh in 1904 by a British colonial judge named Thomas Troward. Most students who encounter Wattles eventually begin to sense that something lies behind his words, a structure more formal than he chose to articulate, a principle more precisely reasoned than the warm, declarative prose of The Science of Getting Rich ever fully reveals. That sensation is not an illusion. It is the faint resonance of a deeper document pressing through the surface of Wattles's text. The reader who follows that resonance to its source arrives sooner or later at Thomas Troward. And at that point, the Wattles they thought they understood begins to look like a single chapter drawn from a much larger treatise. What they had mistaken for the full law was, in truth, the application. The application is useful. The law is irrefutable. Thomas Troward spent most of his professional life as a divisional judge in the Punjab, one of the most demanding legal appointments in the British colonial system, requiring precisely the kind of structured, analytical thinking that marks every page of his metaphysical writing. He was not a mystic who arrived at his conclusions through vision or temperament. He was a man trained in evidence, in logical inference, and in the precise construction of argument. And he brought all of that discipline to bear on a question that most men of his era treated as either theological or fantastical. Is there a law governing the relationship between mind and matter that can be stated with the same rigor and precision as a legal principle? He retired from the Indian Civil Service in 1896 and turned his full attention to answering that question. The Edinburgh lectures, delivered 8 years later to a small gathering in Queen Street Hall, were his answer. They are arguably the most rigorous theoretical document in the history of New Thought, and almost no one outside serious students of the tradition has read them. Troward himself acknowledged that even his original audience, captivated and willing as they were, could barely follow the density of his argument. His writing was a singular and demanding combination: the analytical precision of a legal mind, the metaphysical vocabulary of a man who had studied the sacred texts of India, Hebrew scripture, and Western philosophy with equal seriousness, all compressed into prose that makes no concession to the casual reader. He did not write to persuade, he wrote to demonstrate. And the demonstration, once grasped, does not leave the reader unchanged, because what Troward demonstrates is not a belief to be accepted or rejected. It is a mechanism to be understood. In this examination, we are going to read Troward's law in its original form. We are going to show exactly how Wattles translated it into The Science of Getting Rich. And we are going to demonstrate why understanding the source makes the application not only clearer, but fundamentally more reliable, because you will finally understand not just what to do, but the exact mechanism by which it works. This is not a restatement of ideas you have already encountered. This is the architecture beneath those ideas. And once you see it, you will not be able to read a single page of Wattles, of Holmes, of any New Thought writer of consequence, without seeing Troward's framework operating beneath the surface of every sentence they wrote. If you have already committed to the practice, if you have already accepted that thought influences material conditions and have attempted to work with that principle, then what follows will not require you to change what you do. It will require you to understand for the first time why what you do either works or fails. The difference between a practitioner who applies a method and a practitioner who understands the law behind the method is the difference between a man who can follow a recipe and a man who understands chemistry. The recipe may succeed or fail depending on conditions the cook cannot explain and therefore cannot correct. The chemist understands the conditions themselves. Troward was the chemist. Wattles was the recipe. Both have value, but only one of them gives you dominion over the process. The commitment this requires from you is not faith and not effort in the conventional sense. It is the willingness to follow an argument to its conclusion without flinching, to allow a legal mind's precision to disassemble what you think you understand about the relationship between your thought and your material circumstances, and to reassemble it on a firmer foundation. Troward once described the purpose of his Edinburgh lectures as the provision of an intelligible starting point for the practical study of the subject. That is what we're offering here, not inspiration, not motivation. A starting point that is, for perhaps the first time in your study of this subject, genuinely intelligible, because it rests not on assertion, but on law. Troward opens the Edinburgh lectures by drawing a line that no other thinker of his era had drawn with this degree of precision. He distinguishes between two fundamental modes of mental operation, which he names the objective mind and the subjective mind, and the distinction he draws between them is not merely terminological, it is ontological, a distinction concerning the nature of being itself, the nature of what each mind is at the level of its essential character, and what each mind is therefore capable of doing. This is the foundation of everything that follows in his system, and it is the foundation of everything that Wattles subsequently built. To understand this distinction is not to acquire a new vocabulary. It is to see the structure of reality from a vantage point that most people never occupy. The objective mind in Troward's system is the conscious, voluntary, reasoning faculty. It is the mind you use when you deliberate, when you evaluate evidence, when you choose. It operates by inductive reasoning, comparing instances, weighing evidence, forming judgments from observation. It is the mind of the relative world, the world of conditions, comparisons, and distinctions. It is also, crucially, the initiating faculty, the center of volition from which the creative process begins. Every deliberate mental act originates here in the objective mind's capacity to choose, to direct its attention, and to hold a particular image in its field of awareness with sustained intention. Without the objective mind, there is no initiation, and without initiation, the creative sequence does not begin. The subjective mind is something altogether different in its nature and its function. Troward describes it as deductive only. It does not observe, compare, or evaluate. It does not initiate. It receives, and having received, it executes. What it executes with absolute fidelity, working out every impression placed upon it to its most rigorously logical material consequences, without deviation, without preference, and without the power of refusal. An impression placed upon the subjective mind is not merely received and stored. It is taken up as a directive, as a design specification for the creative work the subjective mind will now undertake, and that work proceeds with the same inevitable logic by which a mathematical conclusion follows from its premises. The conclusion cannot deviate from the premise. The subjective mind cannot deviate from the impression. What makes this distinction so consequential is its corollary, the corollary that Troward states plainly, and that most readers of Wattles have never been in a position to fully appreciate. If the subjective mind is deductive only, if it accepts without evaluation whatever the objective mind impresses upon it and works that impression out to its material conclusion, then the subjective mind is entirely without moral agency, without preference, without the capacity to distinguish between impressions that would serve the individual and impressions that would destroy him. It executes all of them with equal fidelity. The law does not protect the ignorant. It operates upon them with precisely the same mechanical certainty with which it operates upon the informed. This is what Troward means when he says the law is not moral. He does not mean it is immoral. He means it is prior to morality, a mechanism that precedes the question of good and bad in the same way that gravity precedes the question of where one wishes to fall. This is where the reverse bridge must be built. The modern person who has studied personal development literature has been told, in one form or another, that their thoughts influence their reality. They have been told this in language designed to inspire them, to make them feel capable, to generate the emotional state that produces compliance with the method. And so the idea sits in their mind at the level of a belief, a hopeful proposition they have chosen to adopt, which they abandon when conditions seem to contradict it, which they reinforce when results seem to confirm it, and which never achieves the status of a law because it was never presented to them as one. Troward presented it as a law 40 years before it became the organizing thesis of the self-improvement industry. He presented it without warmth, without encouragement, and without the slightest interest in whether the reader found it comforting. He presented it as a judge presents a verdict on the basis of evidence in the form of a conclusion from which there is no appeal. The evidence Troward draws on is not mystical. It is empirical, drawn from the extensive body of experimental work on hypnosis that had been conducted in the latter half of the 19th century by researchers of international standing. 2 major medical schools in Europe had by Troward's time founded their practice upon the documented phenomena of the hypnotic state, and what those phenomena demonstrated above all other things was the radical difference between the 2 modes of mind. Under hypnosis, the conscious faculty, the objective mind, is effectively suspended, and the subjective mind is exposed directly to the impressions of an external operator. The results were not ambiguous. The subject, once the objective mind's guardianship was removed, accepted every impression the hypnotist provided, not as a suggestion to be evaluated, but as a fact to be enacted. He believed himself to be whatever he was told he was, and his body, his behavior, and his experience conformed with absolute precision to that belief. The subjective mind builds whatever the objective mind declares to be true. This demonstration, clinical, repeatable, verified across hundreds of experimental instances, was Troward's empirical anchor. He did not ask his reader to accept a metaphysical principle on the basis of philosophical argument alone. He pointed to an established scientific fact. The subjective mind, when exposed to an impression without the interference of the objective mind's critical faculty, executes that impression into physical reality with complete fidelity. The hypnotic demonstration is merely the clearest case of a universal process. What the hypnotist does to the subject in the experimental room, the individual's own habitual thought does to his own subjective mind every day of his life. The only difference being that outside the experimental room, the impressions are accumulated, repetitive, and largely unconscious. The implications of this are not merely interesting, they are total. If the subjective mind executes whatever the objective mind most consistently impresses upon it, then the material conditions of your life, the state of your finances, the character of your relationships, the limits of what you believe possible for yourself, are not circumstances that have happened to you. They are the faithful material execution of the accumulated impressions your objective mind has been placing on your subjective mind for the whole of your existence. Every condition is a consequence. Every consequence has an impression as its cause, and every impression was placed there by the activity of your own objective mind, whether deliberately or by default, whether in conscious intention or in the unconscious repetition of inherited patterns of thought. This is the law, as Troward states it. It is not a comforting statement. It was not designed to be. The word mechanical is the word Troward reaches for, and it is exactly the right word. He does not say the subjective mind is responsive to thought. He says it executes thought with mechanical fidelity. The same fidelity with which a printing press executes the type set upon it, without preference for the beauty or ugliness of the text, without the power to correct an error or embellish a virtue. The press makes material what the typesetter has composed. The subjective mind materializes what the objective mind has impressed. The quality of the product depends entirely and exclusively on the quality of what was said. This analogy is more than illustrative. It is structurally precise, and its precision is what makes Troward's account of the law categorically different from every account of the same law that has been written since, in more accessible, more inspirational, and more diluted form. What must be understood at this stage, before proceeding to the full architecture of the creative sequence, is the relationship between the law's mechanical character and the individual's responsibility within that mechanism. Because the subjective mind executes without preference, the individual cannot delegate the quality of the impression. There is no force external to the objective mind that determines what the objective mind chooses to hold as the dominant content of its attention. The individual is not a victim of the law. The individual is the sole agent of the impression, and therefore the sole cause of the conditions the law produces. This is simultaneously the most liberating and the most demanding truth in Troward's entire system. Liberating because it means conditions can be changed by changing the impression. Demanding because it means no one else can change the impression, and no circumstance external to the individual determines what the impression will be. Consider what this means for the way you have understood your own material situation until this moment. Every explanation you have ever accepted for a condition you did not want, every attribution of your circumstances to luck, to other people's decisions, to the economy, to timing, to the accidents of birth, is, from the standpoint of Troward's law, a misidentification of cause, not because those external factors do not exist, but because the subjective mind does not receive impressions from external factors directly. It receives them exclusively from the objective mind. And the objective mind's response to external circumstances, the meaning it assigns to them, the conclusions it draws, the self-image it sustains in their presence, is the impression. External circumstances are stimuli. The impression is the meaning the objective mind makes of the stimuli. The subjective mind executes the meaning, not the event. This distinction between the event and the meaning assigned to the event is the precise point at which Troward's law diverges from every form of fatalism and every form of naive optimism simultaneously. The fatalist says the external event determines the outcome. Troward says the impression determins the outcome. The naive optimist says one need only feel good and external conditions will improve. Troward says the impression must be specific, clear, and sustained. Feeling is not an impression. It is the emotional weather that surrounds the impression, and it is the impression itself that the subjective mind executes. Both positions miss the exact mechanism. Troward's account of the objective and subjective minds specifies the mechanism with a precision that neither fatalism nor naive optimism possesses, and that precision is the very thing that makes working with the law reliable rather than occasional. The law, as Troward concludes in his treatment of objective and subjective mind, is not subject to petition, to prayer in the conventional sense, or to any external intercession. It is subject only to the quality of the impression. This means that the student who understands the law is not in a better relationship with a willing universe. He is in a more precise relationship with a mechanical one. The universe, in Troward's account, does not favor those who deserve it, does not respond to those who desire it most intensely, and does not withhold itself from those it judges unworthy. It executes what is impressed upon it with perfect fidelity for every person in every condition at every moment, without exception. The man who understands this does not become hopeful, he becomes precise. This is why the Edinburgh lectures remain more than a century after their delivery in a category apart from all the literature that has descended from them. Every subsequent writer in the New Thought tradition, Wattles included, simplified Troward for accessibility, and in simplifying him, softened the iron edge of his central claim. The claim is this: the law operates on everyone always without moral discrimination, and the quality of its output is determined solely by the quality of the input. You are not at the mercy of this law. You are its operator. Whether you operate it well or badly, deliberately or inadvertently, is the only question the law leaves open. The answer to that question is what the Edinburgh lectures exist to provide. With the nature of the objective and subjective mind established, Troward proceeds to describe what he calls the creative sequence, the complete and unbroken chain from an initial thought held in the objective mind to its final expression as a material condition in the external world. This is the structural core of his entire system, and it is the architecture that Wattles presupposes but never fully explicates. To understand the creative sequence is to understand not merely that thought influences matter, but the precise pathway through which that influence operates, the specific points at which the sequence can succeed or fail, and the exact nature of the variable that the individual practitioner controls. The sequence begins in the individual objective mind, which holds a clear, vivid, specific image of a desired condition. Troward's language here is exacting. The impression must be an image, a formed, specific representation of the desired state, not a wish, not an emotion, and not a vague orientation toward improvement. A wish is a statement of dissatisfaction with present conditions. An emotion is a state of the body. An orientation is a tendency without a target. None of these constitutes an impression in Troward's technical sense. An impression, as he defines it, is a specific, formed idea presented to the subjective mind as a present reality. And it is the specificity and the presentness that are the operative factors, not the intensity of the desire accompanying it. From the individual objective mind, the impression passes to the individual's subjective mind. This is the first transition in the sequence, and it is the transition most easily disrupted. The individual subjective mind, as Troward has established, accepts whatever the objective mind presents with the most consistency and force. The word consistency is critical here. A single clear impression, held once and then abandoned, does not reach the subjective mind with sufficient depth to initiate the creative process. The impression must be sustained, held as the dominant content of the objective mind's attention over a period of time sufficient for it to become, in Troward's formulation, the most deeply embedded directive in the subjective mind's operative pattern. What disrupts this transition is not the absence of desire, but the presence of counter-impressions, the habitual thoughts of doubt, fear, and limitation that the individual has been forming for years, and which compete with the new impression for dominance in the subjective mind's attention. The second transition in the sequence is the one that gives it its cosmological magnitude. The individual subjective mind is not a private faculty sealed within the boundaries of the individual. Troward is insistent and precise on this point. The individual subjective mind is a differentiation of the universal subjective mind. The same creative medium, localized and individualized, in the same way that a specific current is a differentiation of the same ocean that surrounds all shores. Because the individual subjective is a mode of the universal subjective, an impression that reaches sufficient depth in the individual subjective passes, without break or discontinuity, into the universal subjective. It does not travel there. It is already there, because the individual subjective and the universal subjective are not two things in communication, but one substance in two modes of expression. The universal subjective mind is, in Troward's account, the creative power of nature itself, the intelligence that underlies and permeates all matter, that organizes the cosmos from primordial substance, that builds and sustains every form in the natural world. It is not a consciousness in the personal sense. It has no preferences, no personality, no agenda of its own. It is pure creative responsiveness, and it responds with the same creative fidelity on the scale of the individual as it does on the scale of the cosmos, because Scale is a feature of the conditioned world, and the universal subjective operates from the plane of the absolute, where the elements of time and space do not constitute limitations. When an impression reaches the universal subjective begins to organize circumstances, events, and physical conditions in correspondence with that impression. This is not metaphor. In Troward's system, it is the literal description of the mechanism. What the universal subjective does with the impression it receives is something Troward describes with a characteristic analogy drawn from the physical sciences of his era. He points to the concept of a nucleus, a center of attractive force that, once established, draws to itself material of a corresponding nature, building outward from within until an external form of sufficient correspondence with the internal pattern comes into manifest existence. The nucleus does not force conditions into being. It does not override existing structures by sheer power. It organizes them. It draws toward itself through the operation of the universal law of attraction, which Troward treats not as a mystical concept, but as a structural principle of how organized systems coalesce from undifferentiated material. The specific circumstances, encounters, resources, and events that correspond to the pattern of the original impression. The external world rearranges itself around the nucleus, not because it has been commanded to, but because the same creative intelligence that built the external world in the first place is now organizing a new portion of it in correspondence with a new design. The sequence then runs as follows. The individual objective mind forms a specific, present tense image of a desired condition. This image is impressed upon the individual subjective mind through sustained, consistent mental attention. The individual subjective transmits the impression to the universal subjective, of which it is a differentiation. The universal subjective establishes the impression as a nucleus of creative force. And from that nucleus, the material conditions corresponding to the impression begin to organize themselves into external reality. Each step in this sequence is governed by a principle that can be understood, worked with, and, critically, violated, and whose violation produces specific and predictable failures. The creative sequence is not a prayer, it is an architecture. And like all architecture, it fails predictably when its principles are violated and succeeds reliably when they are observed. The principle governing the first step, the formation of the impression in the objective mind, is specificity. Vagueness at this stage produces vagueness in the material outcome because the universal subjective executes exactly what it receives. A vague impression produces a vague nucleus, and a vague nucleus attracts corresponding conditions that are themselves indeterminate and undefined. This is why Troward insists that the impression must be a clear image, not a feeling of general upliftment or a desire for unspecified improvement. The subjective mind is a deductive instrument. It works from premises. If the premise is unclear, the conclusion will be correspondingly unclear, and the material world, which is the domain of conclusions, will reflect that lack of definition. The principle governing the second step, the transmission from individual objective to individual subjective, is consistency. The subjective mind does not execute the impression that was most recently placed upon it. It executes the impression that has been most deeply and consistently established within it. This is why a single moment of vivid visualization followed by hours of worried, doubtful, scarcity-oriented thought produces no creative result. The worried, doubtful thought is also an impression. It has, in most people, far more depth and duration than any deliberate creative image. For the deliberate impression to become the dominant operative pattern in the individual subjective, it must be maintained with sufficient consistency to achieve greater depth than the competing impressions of limitation that have been accumulating for years. This is not a matter of effort. It is a matter of persistence and exclusivity. The principle governing the third step, the passage from individual subjective to universal subjective, is what Troward calls thinking in the absolute. To think in the absolute means to form the impression without reference to the conditions that presently surround the individual in the external world. The moment the individual introduces conditions into the impression, the moment they qualify the image of the desired state with the present evidence against it, they have imported the relative into the absolute, and the impression they place on the universal subjective is correspondingly conditional. The universal subjective executes the impression it receives, which is now an image of the desired condition as conditioned by present limitation. The result is not the desired condition. It is a version of it hedged by the very limitations the individual introduced into the impression. Thinking in the absolute means refusing to allow the present evidence of conditions to determine the content of the impression. It means impressing the universal subjective with what is desired as if it were already the present fact, rather than as something hoped for against the evidence of what currently exists. The fourth principle, the nucleus drawing to itself corresponding material, is not directly under the individual's control and requires no deliberate management beyond the maintenance of the impression. The universal subjective does not require instruction in how to organize matter. It has been doing so since before individual consciousness existed. What it requires from the individual is the impression, clear, consistent, absolute, and the subsequent non-interference. This is the hardest part of the creative sequence for most practitioners to execute, and Troward identifies why with surgical precision. Once an impression has been placed and the creative process has begun, the objective mind, observing the external world and finding that conditions have not yet visibly changed, forms new impressions based on the absence of visible evidence. These new impressions are counter-impressions. They are placed on the subjective mind with the same force as the original deliberate impression, and they disrupt the nucleus precisely as its organizing work has begun. The practitioner who cannot maintain the original impression in the face of unchanged external conditions is introducing the very disruption that prevents the sequence from completing. This is the precise point at which Wattles' instruction to hold the image with gratitude and faith connects to a specific mechanical function in Troward's architecture. Faith, in this context, is not a theological virtue. It is the operational state of the objective mind in which the impression is maintained without the counter-impression of doubt, not because external conditions confirm it, but because the individual understands the mechanism well enough to know that external conditions are the last step in the sequence, not the first. The practitioner who waits for external conditions to confirm the impression before maintaining it is waiting for the effect to precede the cause. The sequence does not operate in reverse. Conditions are the product of the impression, not the validation of it, and the practitioner who treats the absence of visible results as evidence against the impression is misreading the mechanism and placing a counter-impression precisely when the original impression most needs the field left clear for its work to complete. The creative sequence, understood in its full architecture, reveals something that Wattles gestures toward but never names with Troward's precision. The reason why working with the law requires a fundamental change in the relationship between the objective mind and the evidence of present conditions. The untrained objective mind forms its impressions reactively. It sees present conditions and forms its sense of what is possible from them. It allows the external world to determine the content of its mental state, which means it allows existing conditions to impress upon the subjective mind the very patterns that produced those conditions in the first place. This is the mechanism of stasis, not fate, not external forces conspiring against the individual, but the individual's own objective mind, faithfully impressing upon the universal subjective the conditions it observes, which the universal subjective faithfully continues to produce. The loop is unbroken, not by any external force, but by the individual's own habitual surrender of the objective mind's initiating function to the evidence of what already exists. To break this loop is to use the objective mind deliberately, to impose upon the universal subjective an impression drawn not from present conditions, but from chosen intention, and to sustain that impression with sufficient consistency and depth for the new nucleus to achieve dominance over the old pattern. This is the whole of the practice, stated in terms of the creative sequence. It does not require belief in the metaphysical. It requires understanding of the mechanism. And the mechanism, stated with Troward's legal precision, is this. The subjective mind executes the dominant impression placed upon it by the objective mind, and the universal subjective executes the dominant impression placed upon it by the individual subjective. Control the impression, and you control the sequence. Control the sequence, and you govern the conditions, not by wishing, not by deserving, by law. The law, in Troward's final formulation, operates with the same necessity as the laws governing physical nature. It cannot be suspended, it cannot be appealed, it cannot be made to produce a result other than the one that corresponds to the impression placed upon it. What this means for the practitioner is profound. There are no accidents in the creative life of the individual. Every condition is a consequence. Every consequence has an impression as its cause. The question is never whether the law is operating. The question is always, what impression is currently dominant in my subjective mind, and what conditions is the universal subjective therefore in the process of executing? Answer that question honestly, and you have a diagnosis. Change the dominant impression, and you have the remedy. This is the creative sequence, stated as a law. This is what Troward built. This is what Wattles assumed. Rid the science of getting rich immediately after the Edinburgh lectures, and the translation is not merely visible. It is unmistakable. Wattles did not disguise his source. He transmuted it. He took Troward's precise philosophical architecture and refracted it through a single, sustained practical purpose: the acquisition of material wealth through the deliberate application of mental law. The result was a document of remarkable practical power. but a document that stripped away the theoretical scaffolding and left the practitioner with the building without the blueprints. When you return to Wattles with Troward in mind, you are not reading between the lines. You are reading the original text beneath the translation, and the correspondence is, in places, almost word for word in its conceptual structure. Wattles's Formless Substance is Troward's universal subjective mind. The correspondence is not approximate, it is exact. Troward describes the universal subjective as the all-pervading creative medium, the intelligent substance underlying all physical forms, responsive to impression, devoid of personal volition, executing whatever is impressed upon it with absolute creative fidelity. Wattles describes the formless substance as the thinking stuff from which all things are made, which takes the form of its thought, and which, when a thought is held clearly and steadily in the mind of a person, responds by organizing matter in correspondence with that thought. The vocabulary differs because Wattles was writing for a popular audience and Troward was writing for a philosophical one. The principle is identical. Wattles' act of impressing a thought upon the formless substance is Troward's objective mind transmitting an impression to the universal subjective. Wattles instructs the reader to form a clear mental image of the desired condition and to hold it with gratitude and unshaken faith, allowing no doubts or fears to disturb it. Troward explains why these instructions correspond to mechanical necessities. The image must be clear because the subjective executes exactly what it receives. It must be held consistently because competing impressions of doubt displace it. And it must be held as a present reality, not a future hope, because the universal subjective, operating on the plane of the absolute where time is not a conditioning element, executes impressions as present facts or not at all. Wattles's certain way, the phrase he uses to describe the specific quality of mental and physical action required to produce reliable results, is Troward's prescription for the conditions under which the impression reaches the universal subjective cleanly and completely. When Wattles says that acting in the certain way means moving toward the desired state with absolute faith, with gratitude for what is already being organized on the creative plane, and without the mental posture of competition, which he treats as a form of mental scarcity that corrupts the creative process. He is restating three of Troward's specific mechanical requirements: that the impression be free of counter-impressions of doubt and fear, that the objective mind operate from the plane of the absolute rather than the relative, and that competitive thought, which impresses upon the universal subjective the image of scarcity and opposition, be replaced by creative thought, which impresses the image of origination and abundance. Even the language of harmony and discord that runs through Wattles's treatment of the relationship between the individual mind and the formless substance is drawn directly from Troward's description of the objective mind's capacity to be either in or out of alignment with the creative character of the universal subjective. Troward states that the universal subjective, as pure creative intelligence, works always from a principle of expansion, growth, and increase. It is the originating creative force of nature, and its nature is inherently generative rather than restrictive. An objective mind that impresses images of expansion and creative increase upon the universal subjective is operating in alignment with the universal's own nature. An objective mind that impresses images of scarcity, competition, or lack is operating against the current, and the universal subjective, executing that impression with the same fidelity as any other, produces corresponding conditions of restriction and want, not as a punishment, not as a judgment, but as the pure mechanical consequence of an impression placed by the individual against the grain of the creative medium. The competitive plane, as Wattles names it, is the mental posture in which the individual operates from the assumption that wealth and abundance are finite, that what one person gains must come from what another loses. This posture produces a specific impression on the universal subjective, an image of the world as a closed system in which resources are scarce and the individual's share is contingent on successfully contesting with others for a limited supply. The universal subjective, receiving this impression, executes it. It organizes the individual's experience in correspondence with the image of scarcity and contest. The individual then finds, in their external experience, precisely the conditions of competition and limitation they feared, which confirms their original impression, which deepens it, which the subjective executes with even greater fidelity. The loop closes, and the individual remains trapped within it, entirely through the mechanism of their own mental operation, without the intervention of any external force, and without any deficiency in the law itself. The creative plane, by contrast, is the mental posture in which the individual operates from the assumption that the universal subjective is an inexhaustible creative medium, that the individual is not taking from a finite supply, but drawing new conditions into existence from an infinite formative substance that creates without depletion. This posture produces an entirely different impression, an image of abundance as a creative reality already in existence at the level of principle, waiting only for a sufficiently clear and consistent impression to organize it into a specific material form. The universal subjective executes this impression with the same fidelity it gives to all others, and the individual's external conditions begin to reorganize in correspondence with the creative pattern impressed upon the formative medium. Wattles arrived at this distinction through intuition, observation, and the practical distillation of what worked. Troward arrived at it through deduction from first principles. The destination is the same, only the path differs. What Wattles calls gratitude is, in Troward's architecture, the mental state in which the objective mind acknowledges the operation of the law as already in effect, a state in which the individual, while the external conditions have not yet materially manifested, treats the creative work already underway in the universal subjective as a present fact warranting acknowledgement. This is not a psychological technique for feeling good. It is the specific posture of the objective mind that most reliably prevents the formation of counter-impressions. When the objective mind is in the posture of gratitude for what is being organized, it is not scanning the external environment for evidence against the impression. It is, in the language of Troward's mechanics, holding the impression steady on the plane of the absolute, refusing to allow the plane of the relative, the realm of present visible conditions, to supply counter-impressions that disrupt the creative sequence. The relationship between Troward and Wattles, understood fully, reveals something about the nature of practical genius that is worth pausing to examine. Wattles possess the gift of translation without dilution, the ability to take an abstract theoretical architecture and render it in direct, actionable prose without losing the essential mechanism beneath the simplification. The measure of that gift is the fact that practitioners who have never read Troward can work with Wattles' instructions and produce real results because the instructions, properly followed, produce the impressions that Troward's law requires. But translation always carries a cost, and the cost Wattles paid for accessibility was precision. The practitioner who follows Wattles' instructions without understanding Troward's principles cannot correct their errors systematically because they do not understand the mechanism the errors are disrupting. They can follow the recipe. They cannot adjust the chemistry. The most significant consequence of this gap between the Wattles student and the Troward student is the Wattles student's relationship to failure. When the law fails to produce the expected result, the Wattles student has no recourse but to try harder, to visualize more intensely, to feel gratitude more sincerely, to act with greater faith. What they lack is the diagnostic capacity that Troward's architecture provides, the ability to identify at which specific point in the creative sequence the process failed. Did the impression lack specificity, and therefore the nucleus was too vague to attract correspondence? Did counter-impressions of doubt displace the positive image before it reached sufficient depth in the subjective? Did the objective mind introduce conditions into the impression, thereby importing the plane of the relative into the absolute and qualifying the creative work with the very limitations it was designed to transcend? Each of these failures is distinct. Each has a distinct correction. Without Troward's architecture, the practitioner cannot diagnose. Without diagnosis, correction is guesswork. This is the full magnitude of what it means to understand the source. It does not merely give the Wattles student a more philosophical frame for what they already practice. It gives them the diagnostic precision that separates the practitioner who gets consistent results from the one who gets occasional results and cannot account for the difference. Troward's architecture is not more mystical than Wattles. It is less mystical. It removes the mysticism from the practice entirely and replaces it with a law that is as precise, as impersonal, and as dependable as any principle in natural science. The practitioner who understands Troward has ceased to believe in mental law. They have come to know it, which is a different condition entirely, with different consequences for the quality and consistency of their practice. Every instruction in the science of getting rich has its why in the Edinburgh lectures. This is not a rhetorical claim. It is a provable structural fact. Wattles instructs the reader to form a clear mental image because the subjective is deductive and executes only from a specific impression. He instructs the reader to hold it with faith because faith is the operational state in which counter-impressions are excluded. He instructs the reader to act with gratitude because gratitude is the posture of the objective mind that most reliably maintains the impression on the plane of the absolute. He instructs the reader to abandon competitive thought because competitive thought impresses the image of scarcity upon the universal subjective, which executes it faithfully. Every rule Wattles gives is the application of a principle Troward derived. Every application makes fuller sense when the principle is understood. and the principle, stated in its original form, is not a teaching, it is a law. Understanding the mapping between Troward and Wattles does not diminish Wattles' achievement. It measures it more accurately. Wattles made the mechanism accessible to men and women who would never read a philosophical text, who needed practical instruction in a form that could be immediately applied, and who would not have benefited from the density and abstraction of Troward's original exposition. That service has genuine value, and the number of lives materially altered by. The science of getting rich testifies to the effectiveness of the translation, but the translation success does not make the original dispensable. In precisely the same way that a man may use a lever effectively without understanding mechanics, and yet the knowledge of mechanics allows him to use the lever in conditions where intuition alone would fail him, the Wattles student benefits from Troward in proportion to the difficulty of the conditions in which they are attempting to apply the law. Wattles tells you to think in the formless. Troward tells you why that instruction works at the level of mental architecture. This is the essential distinction between the two texts, and it is the distinction that determines whether a student of the law is working with understanding or with instruction, and whether, when the instruction meets resistance, they have the resources to press through it. Wattles gives you what to do. Troward gives you the ground beneath what to do, the terrain of principle from which every instruction issues and to which every failure can be traced. To possess both is to occupy a fundamentally different position in relation to the practice than the student who possesses only one. Wattles tells you to hold the image with faith. Troward explains what faith accomplishes at the mechanical level of the creative sequence. Faith, in Troward's architecture, is not a spiritual virtue to be cultivated for its own sake. It is the operational state of the objective mind in which the clear, specific impression is maintained on the plane of the absolute without the introduction of counter-impressions, drawn from the relative plane of present conditions. What faith does mechanically is prevent the objective mind from disrupting the nucleus it has established in the universal subjective by re-impressing the subjective with images of doubt, scarcity, and the apparent absence of evidence. The counter-impression of doubt is not merely a failure of courage. It is, in Troward's precise account, a replacement impression, one that the subjective mind receives and begins to execute with the same fidelity it gives to the positive image. Doubt does not weaken the positive impression. It displaces it. Understanding this distinction is the difference between a student who tries to believe harder when faith falters, and one who understands that the management of the objective mind's attention is a technical discipline with a specific and identifiable consequence. Wattles tells you that the competitive mind closes the channel between the individual and the creative medium. He states this as a principle, but does not provide the mechanism. Troward provides it. Competitive thought is a specific kind of impression, one that presents to the universal subjective an image of reality as a closed system of scarce resources, in which the desired condition can be obtained only by displacing another's possession of it. This impression has a specific content, and the universal subjective executes that content. It does not close the channel in any mystical sense. It executes the image of scarcity that has been placed upon it, and the material conditions it organizes in response to that image are conditions that correspond to scarcity, limited resources, resistant circumstances, and the sense that what is desired is in the possession of others and cannot be created. The channel is not closed from without. The individual has impressed the image of a closed channel upon the medium that creates whatever it is impressed with. The concept of the creative plane, as Wattles employs it, resolves into a specific technical requirement in Troward's system. The objective mind must form its impression of the desired condition as a creative reality, an origination from the inexhaustible formative substance of the universal subjective, rather than as a competitive acquisition from a finite external supply. The impression of creative origination is structurally different from the impression of competitive acquisition, and the universal subjective, executing each impression with faithful precision, produces structurally different conditions in response to each. The creative impression produces a nucleus that attracts to the individual new resources, new opportunities, and new circumstances that did not previously exist in their experience. The competitive impression produces a nucleus that organizes the individual's experience around the contest for existing resources, which is to say, around the conditions of limitation that the competitive thought presupposes. Wattles instructs the reader to give every person more in-use value than they take in cash value, to add value to every transaction rather than extracting it. And he presents this instruction as a practical rule for operating in the creative rather than the competitive mode. Troward's architecture explains why this rule corresponds to a mechanical necessity. A transaction in which the individual gives more in value than they receive impresses upon the universal subjective an image of abundance, of a mode of operation in which the individual is operating from an inexhaustible creative principle, rather than from the calculation of a scarce supply. This impression, placed consistently upon the subjective, organizes corresponding conditions, a material reality in which the individual experiences abundance rather than scarcity, because abundance is the impression the universal subjective has received and is executing. Wattles arrived at this rule through his understanding of the practical consequences of creative versus competitive thought. Troward's architecture explains why those consequences obtain at the level of mechanism. What Troward explains that Wattles assumes is, at its deepest level, the nature of the universal subjective as the creative medium. Wattles states that the formless substance takes the form of its thought. That thought is the only power which can produce tangible riches from the formless, and that the individual must learn to think in a way that causes this creative process to operate in the desired direction. All of this is stated as axiomatic, as true by the nature of the system, without demonstration. Troward provides the demonstration. He shows, through the evidence of hypnotic experiment, through the logical analysis of the nature of deductive versus inductive reasoning, through the philosophical argument for the unity of spirit and the mathematical necessity that the infinite is a unity, that the universal subjective must be what it is, an impersonal, creative, impression-executing medium, not because it is an appealing hypothesis, but because these properties follow necessarily from the first principles of the nature of spirit and matter. Troward does not ask you to accept the nature of the formless substance. He proves it. The student who reads Wattles without Troward is operating with a powerful instrument whose principles they accept on the basis of assertion and whose failures they cannot explain except as personal inadequacy. The student who reads Wattles with Troward understands the instrument's nature and can work with it not by greater effort, but by greater precision. This is the specific contribution Troward makes to the Wattles practitioner. The replacement of effort with precision. Where the uninstructed practitioner tries harder, the instructed practitioner adjusts the impression. Where the uninstructed practitioner questions their faith, the instructed practitioner identifies whether the objective mind has introduced a counter-impression, and, if so, at what point in the sequence. Where the uninstructed practitioner despairs in the absence of visible results, the instructed practitioner understands that visible results are the last stage of the sequence, and that their absence at any given moment says nothing about the progress of the creative work already underway in the universal subjective. Consider the student who has read The Science of Getting Rich, who has applied the method with sincerity and sustained effort, and who has encountered the most common and most demoralizing outcome of sincere but architecturally uninformed practice: partial results. They achieve something in the direction of the desired condition, but not its fullness. They find their circumstances improving in one area while remaining stubbornly fixed in another. They experience periods of genuine creative momentum, followed by reversals that seem to erase what was gained. Wattles does not give them the language to diagnose this pattern. He gives them the instruction to try again with greater faith, which is the correct instruction, but without the architectural understanding of why the results were partial. It is an instruction they cannot follow to its necessary depth. Troward gives them the diagnosis. A positive impression exists in the subjective mind, but it coexists with a competing pattern of limitation that has sufficient depth and duration to prevent the positive impression from achieving dominance. The remedy is not greater effort. It is the recognition that the competing pattern exists, its patient displacement through the sustained, consistent, deliberate maintenance of the positive impression, and the understanding that the time required for this displacement is proportional to the depth of the competing pattern, not a sign of the law's failure. The Edinburgh lectures are not a supplement to the science of getting rich. They are, in the most precise architectural sense, its foundation, the document from which Wattles built his system, and without which his system is a set of powerful instructions standing on an unexplained base. You can use the instructions without the base. Many people do, and many of them achieve results that testify to the power of the law, even when applied without full understanding. But you cannot achieve reliable, consistent, diagnosable results without the base, because without it, you do not understand the mechanism well enough to manage it deliberately. Troward gives you the base. He gives you the mechanism in the language of a legal mind trained to state principles precisely and argue their consequences rigorously. He gives you, in short, the law, not the application of the law, not the popular translation of the law, but the law itself, stated from first principles, demonstrated from evidence, and argued to its conclusions with the full force of a trained analytical intellect. The most philosophically powerful element of Troward's entire system, the element that distinguishes his account of the relationship between the individual and the universal from every account that preceded it, and most that have followed, is his description of what he calls the differentiation of the individual mind from the universal mind. This is not a minor technical point in his system. It is the philosophical axis around which the entire practical architecture rotates, and without it, the creative sequence is a mechanism whose power is stated, but not fully explained. With it, the creative sequence becomes the description of a process that could not operate otherwise, one whose reliability is not merely asserted, but demonstrated by the very nature of the relationship it describes. Troward does not describe the individual mind and the universal mind as two separate entities that have the capacity to communicate. He describes the individual mind as a differentiation of the universal. The same substance, the same intelligence, the same creative force localized and individualized into a center of self-recognition and volition. The distinction he draws between the two is the distinction between the universal and the particular mode of the same reality, not the distinction between two separate realities of different kinds. This is not a minor semantic adjustment. It is a fundamental claim about the ontological nature of individual consciousness, and it carries practical consequences that are precise enough to be tested against one's own experience. Troward employs an analogy that illuminates this relationship with particular clarity, though he uses it economically, as he uses all analogies, without over-elaborating it. Consider a whirlpool on the surface of a river. The whirlpool is distinguishable from the surrounding water. It has a specific form, a specific location, a specific behavior. It is, in any practical sense, a distinct phenomenon. And yet it is made of nothing other than the water of the river itself. It is not a fragment that has separated from the river and now exists independently of it. It is the river, locally organized into a particular pattern. The river did not give a portion of itself to the whirlpool and thereby diminish itself. It expressed itself in the form of the whirlpool while remaining, in its totality, the river. The individual mind, in Troward's account, is the universal mind, expressing itself in the form of a particular center of volition and self-recognition. The individual is not a fragment of the universal. The individual is the universal, locally organized. What follows from this with logical necessity is that the individual does not stand at a distance from the universal mind and reach toward it across a gap in order to communicate its impressions. The individual mind is the universal mind at the point of individuality. The impression formed by the individual objective mind is not transmitted to the universal subjective across an intervening space, because there is no intervening space. The individual subjective is a mode of the universal subjective, and the impression placed by the individual objective on the individual subjective is, in the same act, placed upon the universal medium of which the individual subjective is a differentiation. There is no transmission problem, no distance to overcome, no petition required, and no intermediary that might intercept or distort the impression in transit. The individual is already inside the creative medium because the individual is a form of the creative medium. The impression falls immediately upon the substance from which it will be materialized, because the substance of the individual mind and the substance of the creative medium are the same substance. This description carries a significance that is easy to miss because it is stated with such philosophical economy. Most approaches to the relationship between the individual and the universal whether in religious, philosophical, or metaphysical literature, presuppose a gap, a distance between the individual and the source of creative power that must be bridged by some form of action, prayer, ritual, or special state of receptivity. The entire architecture of petition, the idea that the individual must ask the universal for what they desire and hope that the universal chooses to grant it, presupposes this gap. Troward eliminates it entirely, not by asserting that the individual is divine in some grandiose sense, but by demonstrating through precise philosophical argument that the individual mind is a particular mode of the universal mind, and that the same creative law that governs the universal operates through the individual by the nature of what the individual is. The practical consequence of this is the replacement of petition with precision. If the individual is not reaching across a gap to contact a separate creative power, but is rather operating from within the creative medium as a differentiated center of that medium's own intelligence, then the only variable in the creative process is the quality of the impression formed by the individual objective mind. There is no external intelligence to be persuaded, no favor to be won, no worthiness to be demonstrated. The universal subjective does not evaluate whether the individual deserves what they are impressing upon it. It executes the impression. The individual's relationship to the creative medium is not the relationship of a petitioner to a patron. It is the relationship of a center of volition to the creative substance from which that center is itself composed. The individual and the creative medium are not two parties engaged in a transaction. They are two modes of the same reality engaged in a process. The distinction between these two conceptions of the individual's relationship to the creative medium is not merely philosophical. It has direct and measurable consequences for the quality of the practitioner's mental posture as they work with the law. The practitioner who conceives of themselves as petitioning a separate universal power is in a mental posture that is structurally different from the one the law requires. They are implicitly operating from a position of separation, of need, of distance, of dependency on an external decision. And this mental posture is itself an impression placed upon the universal subjective. It is an impression of the individual as separate from and dependent upon a power outside themselves, and the universal subjective, executing that impression, produces the corresponding conditions, an experience of separation, of limitation, and of results that come and go, depending on whether the petition happens to produce results at a given time. The practitioner who understands differentiation does not petition. They impress from within the creative medium as a center of that medium's own intelligence, in full command of the sequence by which the impression will be materialized. The concept of differentiation also resolves what Troward identifies as the great philosophical paradox of practical mental science. The paradox of how a universal power can be brought to operate upon a particular condition. The universal, precisely by virtue of being universal, cannot of itself act upon the particular. If it were to single out a particular condition and apply its creative force to it, it would have ceased to be universal and become particular, which is a contradiction in terms. The universal operates on the plane of the universal, not the plane of the particular. This is why an individual cannot simply invoke the universal mind and expect it to directly produce a specific desired condition. The universal does not operate by specification. It operates by law. And the law operates through the individual, not around the individual. Troward's resolution of this paradox is the architecture of differentiation itself. The individual subjective mind, as a differentiation of the universal, is on the one hand connected to the universal creative substance, and on the other hand connected to the individual objective mind, which operates on the plane of the particular and the specific. The individual subjective mind is the bridge between the universal creative power and the particular desired condition. It receives the specific impression from the individual objective and transmits it to the universal creative medium, thereby allowing the universal to act upon the particular through the medium of the individual. Without the individual, the universal has no means of acting upon specific conditions. Without the universal, the individual has no access to the creative power by which specific conditions are produced. They are, in the most precise sense, necessary to each other. Complementary modes of the same creative reality operating in two different dimensions of its own nature. This mutuality of necessity is what Troward means when he says that the individual is the universal's means of expressing itself in the particular. The creative process is not something the universal does for the individual. It is something the universal does through the individual, through the individual's capacity to form a specific impression on the subjective, which is the universal creative medium made particular. The individual who understands this occupies a fundamentally different position in the creative process than one who does not. They do not experience themselves as a small thing reaching toward a large one. They experience themselves as the point at which the large thing focuses itself into specific creative action. The whirlpool is not asking the river for power. The whirlpool is the form through which the river's power is expressing itself at that particular point. The depth of this principle becomes fully apparent only when one considers what it implies about the nature of the individual's creative capacity. Because the individual subjective mind is not a fraction of the universal subjective, but a differentiation of it. The same substance, the same intelligence, the same creative force, locally focused. The individual's access to creative power is not proportional to their individual size or strength. A whirlpool does not draw upon a portion of the river proportional to its own diameter. It draws upon the river's full current, locally organized. In the same way, the individual does not draw upon a portion of the universal subjective proportional to their individual development or worthiness. They draw upon the full creative power of the universal through the channel of their own individual subjective mind in exact proportion to the quality and clarity of the impression they form. The limitation is never in the creative medium. It is always and only in the impression. If the individual mind is a differentiation of the universal, if the individual is not reaching toward the creative medium from outside it, but forming impressions upon a substance of which they are themselves a mode, then the entire practical question of working with the law reduces to a single variable of sovereign importance: the quality and consistency of the impression formed by the individual objective mind. There is no transmission problem, no gap to bridge, no external evaluation to pass. The only question is whether the impression is of sufficient clarity, specificity, and consistency to become the dominant operative pattern in the subjective mind, and therefore the dominant design that the universal subjective is in the process of executing in the external world. A clear, sustained, faith-held image impresses the universal subjective cleanly and completely. This statement, which Troward does not make in precisely these terms, but which his architectural analysis makes inevitable, is the operational conclusion of the differentiation principle. Clean means without the contamination of counter-impressions, without the simultaneous presence in the objective mind of contradictory images that reach the subjective and compete with the positive impression for dominance. Complete means that the impression has achieved sufficient depth in the individual subjective to reach the creative level of the universal, to pass from the surface of conscious intention into the operative layer, where the universal subjective takes up the impression as a directive for creative action. A thought held once, even with great emotional force, does not penetrate to this level. It is the sustained, consistent, patiently maintained impression that achieves the necessary depth. And the depth is necessary not because the universal subjective is reluctant, but because the individual subjective contains layers of accumulated previous impressions that must be progressively superseded. The doubt-laden, urgency-driven, inconsistent impression creates the distorted pattern that the subjective executes as correspondingly distorted conditions. This is worth examining in precise detail because it describes the mechanism of the most common failure mode in the practice of mental law. Urgency is a specific quality of the objective mind's relationship to the desired condition, one in which the condition is experienced as needed rather than chosen, as absent rather than present, as contingent on external circumstances rather than established in creative principle. An impression formed in urgency carries within it the image of lack, because urgency is the feeling of lacking what one urgently needs. The universal subjective, receiving an impression tinted with the quality of urgency, receives not merely the image of the desired condition, but the image of the desired condition as presently absent and urgently needed. It executes both dimensions of the impression with equal fidelity. The result is a material experience that reproduces precisely the psychological posture of urgency. The desired condition hovers just beyond reach, perpetually approaching but never arriving, because the impression of its nearness and the impression of its insufficiency are both present in the original image and both being materialized simultaneously. Inconsistency is a failure of a different kind, an impression that is clear on one day and abandoned on the next, or that is vivid in moments of deliberate practice and dissolved in hours of habitual worry, does not establish a nucleus in the universal subjective with sufficient depth to begin the creative work. The universal subjective is, in Troward's precise description, intensely sensitive to suggestion. It responds to whatever is most consistently impressed upon it, not to what is most intensely felt at any given moment. The practitioner who visualizes with great intensity for a brief period and then spends the majority of their mental life in the habitual patterns of doubt and limitation has not placed the positive impression as the dominant pattern in the subjective. They have placed it as an occasional intrusion into an otherwise undisturbed pattern of limitation. The subjective executes the dominant pattern. Intensity of a brief impression does not override the duration and consistency of the habitual one. This is why Troward's account of sustained practice is not a moral prescription for discipline. It is a mechanical description of how the subjective mind arrives at the impression that it takes as its operative directive. The practical consequences of the differentiation principle for the working practitioner can be stated with concise precision. First, there is no need to increase the force with which an impression is placed because the creative medium is not resisting it. The universal subjective does not require persuasion. It requires a clear, consistent, present tense impression. Force is not the variable. Quality is. Second, there is no need to wait for external conditions to indicate that the creative process has begun, because the creative process begins with the formation of the impression and operates on the creative plane before it produces visible results on the material plane. Waiting for visible evidence before maintaining the impression is waiting for the effect to precede the cause. The law does not operate in reverse. Third, there is no need to address external conditions directly as obstacles to be removed, because external conditions are consequences of previous impressions and will reorganize themselves as new impressions achieve dominance in the subjective. Engaging directly with external conditions as if they were the cause of the individual situation is to address the effect as if it were the cause, which is to say, to misidentify the actual point of leverage. The individual who understands the differentiation principle and its practical consequences possesses something that the student of Wattles alone does not: a precise understanding of what they are doing when they engage in the practice of mental law. They are not performing a ritual that may or may not work depending on mysterious conditions. They are not petitioning an external power whose responsiveness varies with circumstances they cannot control. They are forming impressions on a creative medium of which they are themselves a mode, from within the creative process at the exact point where universal creative power meets particular creative direction. They are, in Troward's most concentrated formulation, thinking in the absolute, holding an image of the desired condition as a present fact on the plane that is prior to all conditions, and thereby allowing the universal creative substance to organize the conditions in correspondence with the image. This is the practice stated as a law. The differentiation principle is what makes the statement of the practice as a law possible, because it explains why the individual's impression has the authority it has over the creative medium, which is the authority of the ocean's current over the form of the whirlpool it has organized from itself. Troward is more specific than Wattles about the precise quality of the impression required for reliable creative results. Where Wattles gives broad prescriptions: hold the image with faith, act in the certain way, maintain the creative rather than competitive mental posture, Troward provides a detailed account of the specific conditions the individual objective mind must maintain simultaneously if the impression it places on the universal subjective is to function as an effective creative directive. These conditions are not additional requirements layered on top of the basic practice. They are the basic practice stated at the level of mechanism rather than instruction. Understanding them transforms the practice from a set of disciplines to be maintained into a set of principles to be understood. And principles, once understood, are self-correcting in a way that disciplines alone never can be. The first condition is specificity. The impression must be a clear, definite image of the desired condition, not a vague desire for improvement, not an emotional state of general positivity, not a direction of movement without a defined destination. Troward's insistence on specificity follows directly from his account of the subjective mind as deductive only, as an instrument that executes the impression it receives as a logical premise and works out its material consequences with strict logical fidelity. The quality of the conclusion is entirely determined by the quality of the premise. A vague premise produces a vague conclusion. A specific premise produces a specific conclusion. The universal subjective does not add specificity to a vague impression. It executes the impression at the level of definition the objective mind provides. If the impression is of general abundance, the subjective executes the conditions of general undefined abundance, and such conditions, being without specific form, manifest as a vague sense of improvement that never resolves into the particular desired condition. This requirement has a diagnostic value that becomes immediately apparent when applied to one's own practice. Consider whether the image you hold in the objective mind when you practice deliberate impression is specific enough to be described in detail to another person, whether it has a form, a location, a set of defining characteristics by which it would be recognizable if encountered in external reality. If the answer is that the image is more of a feeling than a form, more of a direction than a destination, it is not yet specific enough to serve as an effective premise for the subjective mind's deductive work. Troward describes the desired state's spiritual prototype, the image of the condition held in the objective mind, as the archetype from which the material form will grow, in the same way that the form of a building grows from the specificity of the architectural design. An architectural design that specifies only that the building should be large and comfortable will not produce a reliable structure. The specificity of the design is the specificity of the result. The second condition is that the impression must be affirmative, stated and held as a present reality, not as a future hope. This requirement is among the most counterintuitive aspects of Troward's system for the student who first encounters it, but its mechanical justification is precise. The universal subjective, as Troward has established, operates on the plane of the absolute, the plane from which the elements of time and space are absent. On this plane, there is no future and no past. There is only the present. An impression placed upon the universal subjective in the form of "I will have this condition in the future" is not an impression of the desired condition as a present reality. It is an impression of the desired condition as presently absent, as something located at a temporal remove from the present moment. And the universal subjective, operating on the absolute plane where time is not a conditioning element, executes the impression of absence with the same fidelity it would give to any other impression. The individual who consistently impresses upon the subjective the image of a desired condition as a future attainment consistently experiences that condition as remaining in the future, perpetually approaching, perpetually not yet arrived. The third condition is exclusivity. The objective mind must refuse to simultaneously hold counter-impressions. This is Troward's most demanding practical prescription, and it is the one most commonly misunderstood. The practitioner who understands exclusivity superficially attempts to suppress doubt, to prevent the feeling of doubt from arising in consciousness. This is both ineffective and unnecessary. Doubt arises as a function of the objective mind's awareness of present conditions, and the attempt to prevent its arising is an engagement with a natural cognitive process that cannot be suppressed by will. What can be managed is whether the doubt is admitted into the objective mind as an impression, whether it is given the status of a fact that the objective mind holds and presents to the subjective, or whether it is acknowledged as a present feeling arising from the plane of the relative and then deliberately refused admission as a mental image with the status of a creative directive. The distinction between experiencing doubt and impressing doubt upon the subjective mind is the distinction between a feeling and an impression. Feelings arise in the objective mind as responses to external conditions. They are not themselves impressions in Troward's technical sense until the objective mind holds them as images, until it takes the feeling of doubt and forms it into a specific mental picture of the desired condition failing to materialize, of the effort being futile, of the evidence against the law being conclusive. At the moment, the doubt becomes a specific image held in the objective mind with the same deliberateness and clarity that the positive image is held. It becomes an impression, and it competes with the positive impression for dominance in the subjective. Troward's prescription of exclusivity means maintaining the objective mind in the posture in which the positive impression is the only image held with the status of a present creative directive. Not the suppression of doubt as a feeling, but the refusal to elevate it to the status of a competing image with equal claim on the subjective's deductive execution. Doubt, when admitted as an impression, does not weaken the positive image. It replaces it. This is the most precise and consequential statement Troward makes about the management of the objective mind during creative practice. The student who believes that doubt and faith coexist in the subjective as competing forces of different intensities, and that the practice consists in increasing the intensity of the faith until it overpowers the doubt, has misunderstood the mechanism. The subjective does not adjudicate between competing impressions on the basis of intensity. It executes the impression that is most consistently and deeply present as its operative directive. Doubt, when admitted as an image, is an impression of the desired condition as absent or unattainable. The subjective receives this as its directive. It executes it. The result is the absence or unattainability of the desired condition, not as a failure of the law, but as its precise and faithful operation. The three conditions, specificity, affirmative presentness, and exclusivity, are not three separate practices to be maintained by separate efforts. They are three aspects of a single quality of mental attention that, when present, constitutes what Troward means by thinking in the absolute. Thinking in the absolute is the state of the objective mind in which the impression of the desired condition is held as a specific, present tense, undisturbed creative directive, without vagueness, without temporal qualification, and without the simultaneous presence of competing images drawn from the evidence of present conditions. This is not a mystical state. It is a specific discipline of mental attention, available to any person who understands its nature and is willing to practice it with the precision its mechanical requirements demand. The student who has studied Wattles will recognize these three conditions immediately as the structural content of his instructions, stated now at the level of principle rather than prescription. Wattles says to form a clear mental image. That is specificity. He says to think of it as if it were already yours. That is affirmative presentness. He says to hold the image with unshaken faith, refusing to allow doubt to enter. That is exclusivity. In Wattles, these are instructions. In Troward, they are derived conditions, consequences of the nature of the subjective mind that cannot be otherwise without disrupting the creative sequence at a specific and identifiable point. The Wattles student follows the instructions because they have been told they work. The Troward student follows them because they understand why they cannot not work when applied correctly, and why they fail with the same predictability when any of the three conditions is violated. There is a fourth dimension of the impression protocol that Troward addresses in his treatment of the relationship between the objective mind's creative act and the plane of the absolute on which it must operate. He distinguishes between thinking about a desired condition and thinking from the premise of a desired condition. To think about a condition is to place oneself mentally outside it, at a distance from it, treating it as an object of contemplation that is separate from the thinker's present state. To think from the premise of a condition is to take it as the starting point of one's mental activity. To reason as if it were already the present fact, to allow one's thoughts to arise from within the reality of the desired state rather than from without it. This distinction is subtle, but architecturally significant. Thinking about the condition places an image of the thinker in relation to the condition, which imports the spatial and temporal relationship into the impression. Thinking from the condition places the thinker inside it, which is the structural equivalent of holding the impression on the plane of the absolute, where the thinker and the thought are not separated by the distance that the elements of time and space introduce. Troward's account of the impression protocol carries a further implication that most students of practical mental science miss: the quality of the impression, its specificity, its presentness, its exclusivity, is not only a condition for the effective operation of the creative sequence. It is a measure of the practitioner's actual degree of understanding. A practitioner who cannot form a specific impression has not yet clarified what they actually desire. A practitioner who cannot hold the impression as a present reality has not yet internalized the nature of the absolute plane on which the subjective operates. A practitioner who cannot maintain exclusivity has not yet achieved the command of the objective mind that is the individual's specific and unique contribution to the creative process. Each failure in the quality of the impression points to a specific gap in understanding, and each gap in understanding can be addressed by returning to Troward's architectural description of what the subjective mind is and how it operates. This is the precise value of Troward's impression protocol over Wattles's practical instructions. It is self-diagnosing in a way that instructions alone cannot be. When an instruction fails, the uninstructed practitioner can only conclude that they have not followed the instruction well enough and must try harder. When a principle is violated, the instructed practitioner can identify which principle was violated, understand why its violation produced the result it produced, and make the specific correction the violation requires. The prescription protocol is not a set of rules that constrain the practice. It is a description of the conditions under which the law operates reliably, conditions that follow from the nature of the subjective mind, as Troward has established it, and that cannot be otherwise without being in conflict with that nature. Troward addresses directly a question that virtually every serious student of Wattles eventually encounters, and which Wattles does not fully resolve. The question is this: if the law is mechanical and impersonal, if the creative sequence operates with the inevitability of a natural law, why does the practice require such sustained and patient maintenance? If a clear impression placed upon the universal subjective initiates the creative process with mechanical certainty, why does not a single clear impression produce an immediate, visible result? What is the function of repetition? Is it a spiritual discipline, a practice of devotion or humility required to earn the law's operation? Or is it something structural, something that follows from the architecture of the system itself, and that can be understood with the same clarity as every other element of Troward's account? Troward's answer is architectural rather than moral. The requirement for sustained practice is not a spiritual discipline. It is a mechanical consequence of the state of the individual subjective mind at the time the deliberate practice begins. The individual subjective mind is not a blank surface awaiting the practitioner's first impression. It is a surface that has been impressed over the entire course of the individual's life with the accumulated patterns of thought, belief, fear, and limitation that constitute the individual's habitual mental life. These accumulated impressions are not merely stored in the subjective, they are operative. They are the patterns the subjective is currently executing, the patterns from which the individual's present material conditions have been produced and are being maintained. The individual who begins deliberate creative practice does not begin in an empty field. They begin in a field already fully occupied by the operational consequences of decades of prior impression. The accumulated impressions of a lifetime of habitual thought constitute what Troward describes as the established pattern in the subjective, the dominant operative directive that the subjective is currently executing. These accumulated impressions have depth and duration that a new deliberate impression, however clear and specific, does not initially possess. A new impression placed upon the subjective does not erase the established pattern instantaneously, any more than a new groove cut across the surface of a well-worn path instantaneously redirects the flow of water that has been running in that path for years. The new impression establishes a competing pattern, a new groove, a new directive, and as it is maintained and deepened through consistent practice, it progressively increases in relative dominance over the old pattern. But the time required for the new pattern to achieve dominance is proportional to the depth of the old pattern, which is proportional to the years of consistent habitual thought from which the old pattern was formed. This is why Troward describes repetition not as a spiritual virtue, but as the mechanism by which the new impression reaches sufficient depth and consistency to become the dominant pattern the subjective is executing. The practitioner who visualizes the desired condition clearly and consistently for a week is in a fundamentally different position from the one who has maintained that same clear impression consistently for a year, not because the law operates faster for the latter, but because the latter's impression has achieved greater depth relative to the established competing pattern, and is therefore closer to the point at which it becomes the subjective's dominant directive. This is a mechanical description of a mechanical process. It carries no moral implication. The practitioner with a long history of habitual limitation thought is not at a disadvantage because of any moral deficiency. They are at a disadvantage that is purely mechanical in nature and has a purely mechanical remedy. The sustained, consistent, patient maintenance of the new impression until its depth exceeds the depth of the pattern it is displacing. The practical implication of this understanding is a fundamental transformation in how the practitioner relates to the absence of visible results during the early stages of the practice. The uninstructed practitioner, observing that their sustained effort has not yet produced visible external changes, tends to interpret this observation as evidence against the law, as a sign that the method is not working and therefore should perhaps be abandoned or replaced with something more directly effective. This interpretation is a counter-impression of the most damaging kind. It is an impression of the law as ineffective, placed upon the very subjective that the practitioner is attempting to impress with the image of the desired condition at precisely the moment when the new impression is in the early stages of establishing its depth. The counter-impression of the law's ineffectiveness does not merely fail to help. It actively contributes to the maintenance of the old pattern by adding new impressions of limitation and futility to the existing accumulated pattern. The instructed practitioner, understanding that the absence of visible results during the early stages of practice reflects the mechanical process of a new impression, establishing sufficient depth to become the dominant operative pattern, rather than the failure of the law, does not form this counter-impression. They maintain the original impression through the period of apparent inactivity with the same deliberate consistency they brought to it from the beginning, because they understand that the apparent inactivity is not the creative process failing. It is the creative process at work in the creative medium, beneath the surface of the visible external world, organizing the conditions that correspond to the impression before those conditions have yet reached the threshold of external manifestation. The external world changes last. The change begins in the impression, progresses through the subjective, reaches the universal, and only then begins to materialize in external conditions. And the time between the impression and the external manifestation is the time required for the new pattern to displace the old one, and for the universal subjective's creative work to reach the point of physical expression. Understanding the role of repetition as a mechanical requirement rather than a moral one also transforms the practitioner's relationship to inconsistency in their practice. The uninstructed practitioner who misses days of deliberate practice tends to experience guilt, the sense that they have failed in a spiritual discipline and must make amends. The instructed practitioner understands that inconsistency is not a moral failure. It is a mechanical setback, a period in which the new impression was not being deepened and during which the old pattern may have regained some of the relative dominance it had lost. The remedy is not guilt or intensified effort. It is the simple resumption of consistent practice, understood as the resumption of the mechanical process of deepening the new impression relative to the old. The practice, understood mechanically, does not require the practitioner to be perfect. It requires the practitioner to be persistent, which is a different demand, with a different quality of response. This mechanical account of repetition's function also illuminates a phenomenon that many practitioners of mental law observe but cannot fully explain: the experience of sudden breakthrough after a long period of seemingly static practice. The practitioner who has maintained a consistent impression through weeks or months of no visible external change sometimes finds that the conditions they have been impressing toward materialize in a relatively short period following that long plateau. From Troward's architectural perspective, this is not mysterious. The breakthrough point is the moment at which the new impression achieves sufficient depth to become the dominant operative pattern in the subjective. The moment at which the new directive takes over from the old established pattern as the primary design the universal subjective is executing. Up to that point, the creative work was underway, but the old pattern retained sufficient dominance to prevent the new conditions from reaching external manifestation. At the breakthrough point, the tipping occurs, and the conditions that were being organized in the creative medium begin to appear in the external world with what can seem like sudden rapidity. The rapidity is not sudden. It is the completion of a process that has been underway throughout the period of apparent stasis. The full import of Troward's account of repetition is the elimination of the most corrosive form of doubt from the practitioner's experience, the doubt that arises not from a lack of faith in the law, but from a misunderstanding of its timing. The practitioner who understands the mechanical function of repetition does not doubt the law when visible results are delayed. They understand the delay as a structural feature of the creative process, evidence not of the law's failure, but of the depth of the established pattern being displaced. This understanding is itself a contribution to the quality of the impression, because it prevents the formation of the counter-impression of futility at the precise moment, the long, quiet period of building depth, when the impression most needs to be maintained without interference. The practitioner who understands the mechanism maintains the impression through the silence because they know the silence is the sound of the creative sequence at work in the medium below the surface of the visible world. Thomas Troward identified the law that makes every new thought teaching work, including every teaching Wallace Wattles ever produced. The universal subjective mind is the creative medium, the all-permeating intelligent substance that underlies all physical forms, organized matter, and circumstance from primordial substance, and responds with absolute creative fidelity to whatever impression is placed upon it from the plane of the individual objective mind. The individual objective mind is the initiating center, the differentiated point of volition at which the universal creative force focuses itself into the specific creative act of forming a particular impression on the creative medium from which it is itself composed. These two, the initiating center and the responsive medium, are not separate entities in communication. They are two modes of the same reality, organized in a relationship of creative necessity, one to initiate, one to execute. The creative sequence is the mechanism by which thought becomes material condition, the precise chain of causation that runs from the specific impression formed by the individual objective mind through the individual subjective mind into the universal subjective, through the creative work of that medium and out into the external world as organized circumstances and conditions corresponding to the original impression. This sequence operates with the same necessity and the same indifference to the practitioner's desires as any law of physical nature. It does not operate because the practitioner deserves it to. It does not fail to operate because the practitioner is unworthy. It operates because it is a law, and law, in Troward's account of the universe, is the most fundamental feature of reality, the structure within which all events occur and outside of which no event is possible. Understanding this architecture does not replace the practice. It reveals why the practice is not optional, not psychological, and not a matter of belief. The practitioner who does not understand the architecture may still produce results by following the instructions correctly, but they have no means of distinguishing, when results fail to appear, between a failure of the law and a failure of their application of the law. They have no diagnostic framework. They have no principle from which to derive the correction. They are working with a powerful instrument whose mechanism they have never examined, and the limits of their practice are the limits of their instruction. The practitioner who understands Troward's architecture has exchanged the limits of instruction for the resources of principle. And principle is self-extending in a way that instruction is not, because principle can be applied to conditions that instruction has not anticipated. The question this architecture poses to every person who has engaged with these ideas is not whether they believe in the law. The law operates whether it is believed in or not, in the same way that gravity operates whether the person falling believes in it. The question is whether they are using the law deliberately or inadvertently, whether the impressions they are consistently placing upon the universal subjective are the impressions of a conscious creative intent, formed with specificity, affirmative presentness, and exclusivity, or the impressions of habitual, reactive, unconsciously maintained patterns of thought that the subjective is executing with perfect mechanical fidelity into conditions the individual did not consciously choose. Every person alive is operating the law at every moment. The only variable is the quality of the impression, and the quality of the impression is the only variable the individual controls. Control that variable with the precision that Troward's architecture makes possible, and the creative sequence will execute with the same reliability as every other law of nature. The magnitude of what Troward gave to the tradition of mental science, and through that tradition to every subsequent student of the relationship between thought and material conditions, can only be fully measured when one understands what was absent before he wrote. Before Troward, the relationship between thought and material conditions was asserted by Emerson, by Quimby, by Trine, by others, with varying degrees of philosophical sophistication, but always as a proposition to be believed rather than a mechanism to be understood. Troward was the first thinker in the tradition to derive the mechanism from first principles, to ground it in empirical evidence, and to state it with sufficient precision to make it diagnostically useful. He did not build a faith, he described a law. The difference between a faith and a law is the difference between something that works when conditions are favorable and something that works because it cannot do otherwise. Troward's account belongs entirely to the second category. That is what the thumbnail says. That is what the Edinburgh lectures are. That is the source law. The spirit of a thing, Troward writes, is that which is the source of its essential being. This sentence, which appears in his later work, The Creative Process in the Individual, is the concentrated form of everything the Edinburgh lectures established through extended argument. The spirit of the universe must be the source of all being that exists within the universe. Every individual being, every particular form, every center of consciousness and volition that exists within the universe must therefore be a differentiation of the one original being from which the universe's spirit is the source. The individual is not created by the universal and then released into separate existence. The individual is the universal, focused and individualized. The ocean in the form of the whirlpool, the river in the form of the current, the one creative intelligence in the form of the particular center of self-recognition and volition that is the human mind. Since the universal subjective creates whatever the universal objective impresses upon it, since the creative medium executes the directives of the initiating intelligence with absolute fidelity, the individual who thinks from the same quality of certainty as the spirit is not sending impressions to the creative medium. They are the creative medium at the point of individual expression, forming its own directives. They are not petitioning the universal subjective. They are the universal subjective, locally individualized, using its own inherent creative power through the channel of individual volition. This is what Troward means by thinking in the absolute, not a technique, not a mental posture adopted as a strategy, but the recognition of what the individual mind fundamentally is and the exercise of creative authority that flows naturally and inevitably from that recognition. The recognition changes the character of the practitioner's entire relationship to the creative process. The person who has understood differentiation, who has grasped, not merely as an idea, but as a lived recognition, that they are a mode of the creative intelligence that underlies and permeates all reality, does not approach the practice of mental law as a student attempting to master an external technique. They approach it as the universal mind, approaching the exercise of its own inherent creative function at the level of the particular. The certainty this recognition produces is not the certainty of confidence or of emotional conviction. It is the certainty of understanding, the quiet, absolute assurance of one who knows the mechanism from its first principles and has therefore ceased to be in doubt about whether it will operate. The law will operate. It cannot do otherwise. The only question is whether the impression placed upon the creative medium is the impression the individual has chosen to place, or the impression of habitual thought placed there by default. Consider what this means for the quality of your deliberate mental activity. When you form a specific image of a desired condition and hold it as a present reality, you are not attempting to influence an external force. You are exercising the creative function of the universal mind at the point of your individual volition. The impression you form is not a request. It is a directive. It is the creative medium's own intelligence, focused through the lens of your individual objective mind, specifying the form it is to take at the level of your particular material conditions. The universal subjective executes this directive not because you have persuaded it to, not because your desire was intense enough to overcome its inertia, but because that is what it does. Because that is what it is. The execution of a directive by the creative medium is not a favor granted. It is a law fulfilled. And the individual who understands this does not hope for results. They recognize results as the necessary consequence of the operation of a mechanism they understand and have set in motion with deliberate precision. The masters of this tradition, Troward first, Wattles following him, Holmes after Wattles, and all the others who built their systems on the same foundation, were not optimists. They were not people who chose to believe that reality was supportive of human aspiration and found that belief rewarding. They were people who had examined the architecture of the relationship between mind and matter with sufficient rigor to arrive at a conclusion that was not a matter of choice or temperament. The relationship is governed by a law. The law operates mechanically and without exception, and the individual who understands the law and applies it with the precision that understanding makes possible is not hoping. They are, in the fullest sense of Troward's account, governing. They are exercising dominion, the dominion of the initiating intelligence over the creative medium, the dominion of the universal, operating through the individual over the conditions of the individual's material life. Troward's last words on the nature of the individual's relationship to the universal are, in the end, not the words of a philosopher. They are the words of a man who has arrived at a certainty so complete that the tone shifts from demonstration to declaration, from the proving of the law to the naming of what one becomes when the law is fully understood. What one becomes is not powerful in the sense of force or acquisition. One becomes precise. One becomes, in the domain of mental operation, what a master craftsman is in the domain of physical work. Someone who produces exact results through the exact application of exact principles, without waste, without excess, without the anxiety of the uninstructed, and without the need for external validation of a process whose architecture they have fully internalized. This is the condition Troward describes. This is the condition his writing makes available to anyone willing to follow the argument to its end. Examine what you have just encountered. Take it not as information to be stored, but as a lens to be applied. Return to The Science of Getting Rich with Troward's architecture present in your mind and read a single chapter, any chapter. What you will find, if you read with Troward's precision as your guide, is that the chapter you have opened is not a stand-alone set of instructions. It is a set of applications, specific, practical derivations from one or more of Troward's principles, translated into the direct language of action and stripped of the theoretical scaffolding from which they were drawn. Every instruction Wattles gives traces back to a specific point in the creative sequence. Every principle Wattles names corresponds to a precise element in Troward's architectural account of how thought becomes material condition. When you see this mapping for yourself, when you open Wattles and find Troward's architecture visible beneath the surface of every sentence, the experience is not one of accumulating new information. It is one of depth suddenly revealed where you thought you were already standing at the bottom. The building you thought you understood turns out to have a foundation you never saw. And the foundation explains why the building stands where it stands, why it is built the way it is built, and why certain attempts to modify it produced the results they did. This is what the source law gives you, not a new technique, but the ground on which every technique you have already been using stands, made visible at last. The question now before you is not whether to believe in Troward's law. The question is whether to use it with the precision that understanding makes possible. There is a specific conversation that takes place at the intersection of Troward's architecture and Wattles' practical instructions. A conversation that most students of the New Thought tradition have never been in a position to have because they have only possessed one side of the exchange. You are now in a position to have it. Every instruction Wattles gives has a why in Troward. Every why in Troward has a practical consequence in Wattles. Take any instruction from The Science of Getting Rich, the one that has produced the clearest results for you, or the one that has remained most resistant to your application of it, and place it against Troward's creative sequence. Identify which element of the sequence it corresponds to. Understand why its violation produces the failure it produces, and why its correct application produces the result it produces. When you have done that, when you have traced a specific Wattles instruction back to its Troward principle and understood the mechanism that makes it operative, you will have ceased to be a student of the teaching and become a practitioner of the law. The distinction is precise. A student of the teaching follows instructions and hopes they work. A practitioner of the law applies principles and knows why they work. That conversion from hope to knowledge, from instruction to principle, from the practice of a method to the exercise of a law, is what the Edinburgh lectures make possible for the student of Wattles who arrives at them ready to receive them. Troward himself would not have described this as transformation. He would have described it as the replacement of relative knowledge with absolute knowledge, the replacement of knowing about the law with knowing the law. The knowing changes everything. Tell us in the comments which instruction in The Science of Getting Rich now makes the most complete sense to you, now that you can see the Troward principle on which it rests. That examination begins below.